Hello and welcome to episode 63 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today we are going to be talking about what I guess could be either the most fascinating or the most boring episode of the Ask Historians podcast, depending on how you approach it, I guess you could say. I personally think it falls much more towards the fascinating end of the scale. We're going to be talking about milling and baking in 19th century Britain. And in that, it's one of those topics. Well, first of all, our guest is absolutely fantastic and is just, if you are one of his students, I can only say that I envy you getting the lectures. He's a terrific speaker. But also this episode is one of those that the topic touches on, it seems so narrow and so like something you wouldn't go outside the kitchen to look at. But at the same time, it's one of those topics that touches on and covers and reaches out to and connects with all these isms and zations, industrialization, urbanization, nationalism, imperialism, as well as we're going to talk a little about food science and kind of environmental science and agronomy and all these other things as well. Because when you have something that is a staple like bread, and then all of a sudden you enter this system where what had been a unchanging product. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's such a thing as an unchanging product in history. But when you get a previously stable system, I guess you could say, or at least relatively stable, and then you enter into something like what we would call kind of the modern period, this kind of 19th century period where we see the growth of cities, at least in the United States and in Europe, the growth of cities, industrial cities, and changes in the way that people live, not just their own lives, but also live in the way that they interact with the environment and the objects around them. And that includes their diets. And so you can take one, seemingly simple item like, how does bread get made? What does it get made from? Where do the components that make the bread come from? And how do they get there? Why do they come from these certain places? And look at it and kind of look at an entire society through that lens. And you'll be able to touch upon the things like, this shift into cities, this globalization of trade, the growing of, industrial centers in the American Midwest, the growing agricultural breadbasket that is California, and then apply that back to, chimney sweeps in, industrial London. So I hope you'll enjoy the episode. And just let you know, this is part 1 of 2. So this time we're kind of going to go from, I guess, in this episode, we're going to go from medieval England up until, 19th century industrial England and be talking about nationalism when we kind of have to call it quits and then come back for a second round in 2 weeks. Until then, I want to go ahead and thank all of our Patreon subscribers. We have more than met and exceeded every goal we've set out so far. So I need to come up with some more. As we said before, we might do some sort of, fund towards getting people to the HA, but nothing of that has been decided yet. We are going to be doing the Ask Historians book giveaway every month now, thanks to your very generous support. So in the next episode, I will be announcing the slate of books that you can pick from. And then the episode after that, I will pick the winner from there. So it's not too late to get in. Anyone who subscribes, and remember it's $1 to get 1 ticket, $5 to get 2 tickets, $10 to get 3 tickets. So it's not too late to jump on and become a supporter of the podcast. And and potentially get a book back. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and start the episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm here with David Fauser, and we are going to be speaking a great deal about 19th century milling, baking, grain, bread, all sorts of things that you can't eat if you're a celiac. But before we get started, David, could you go ahead and give us an idea about who you are and what got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, I'm a very late graduate student at the University of California, Irvine. I'll finish my PhD in the next month or so hopefully, unless something bad happens. I'm also an adjunct instructor, so I teach at several different colleges and universities around Southern California. And I teach a wide range of classes, as many adjuncts do. So I teach world history, I teach European history. I just picked up a 2-year position at Chapman University part-time where I'm going to teach British Empire and British history. So I'm pretty excited about that.
And so why bread?
Oh, wow. Well, I got interested in environmental history as an older undergraduate student. I was really lucky to take a seminar with a guy named Thomas Andrews, who's written a pretty important book called Killing for Coal, which is a history of coal mining and labor in Colorado. And he introduced me to ideas of environmental history. That is, that we can study the history of relationships between human beings and the non-human world. So this includes things like fire, things like food, things like pollution, more cultural things like our ideas of nature and wilderness. And I was really captivated by that idea. And I found, because I'd always been interested in British history, I found that there was very little of that kind of work on modern Britain. That there was a tradition of historical geography which shares a lot of similarities, but is not quite the same thing. There was a big tradition of things like rural history, which is kind of social history of agricultural populations. There was economic histories of agriculture. There were all these topics in British history that were sort of like environmental history, but nobody was asking quite the same questions. And by that, I mean nobody was really getting to the issue of how is it that British people and British bodies in particular related to the environments around them. And thinking about that question got me to consider food, because we are what we eat, right? And all food comes from some place, comes from some environment somewhere. And I really wanted a food that was culturally significant. So bread is the cultural foundation of our diets. And I wanted something that was also at the center of British diets materially. And there's nothing, bread really is the thing. And if you'd like, I can actually read just I can give you guys a couple of quick quotes here. So one is from a guy named Henry Mayhew. He was I guess you could call him like a proto-ethnographer. He was walking around London in the 1850s, and he wrote a long series called London Labour and the London Poor. And so very first page on his description of the London street folk. He says, "Those who obtain their living in the streets of the metropolis are a very large and varied class. Indeed, the means resorted to in order to pick up a crust, as the people call it, in the public thoroughfares are so multifarious that the mind is long baffled in its attempts to reduce them to scientific order or classification." And he himself makes the point here that when he says pick up a crust, that is to earn one's bread, he means it literally is a crust. Bread was the single most important article of diet in Victorian Britain. It had been for a long time, and it remained so until probably at least World War I and arguably World War II. To give an example, just like a quantitative example, the average male working class person in 19th century Britain probably ate a pound or more of bread per day, which is a lot, right?
I mean, what is the era that we're going to be talking about then? Because, I mean, you mentioned Victorian England, but I gather some of these changes that we're going to talk about kind of matured during that time, but also kind of predated that. So in the scope of our talk, what are we talking about here when we're talking about bread in Britain?
Well, I think the real moment of change is best dated by, I think, the Corn Laws. And so the Corn Laws are a set of taxes, a set of duties on imported grain that are put in place in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in order to keep the price of bread high. And they're put in place by Parliament, really because Parliament at the time was mainly landowners. And so high agricultural prices meant higher rents for them. They could rent their land out for more money. Now, there's a powerful movement for free trade in the 1830s and 1840s in Britain, and it wins. By 1846, they repeal the Corn Laws, and in that year, Britain grew or otherwise provided about 3/4 of what it ate. Now, if we look 70 years later at 1914, the beginning of World War I, that figure had plunged to less than 1/5. So in that 70 years or so, from 1846 to 1914, Britain effectively globalized its food chain. It outsourced food production to the rest of the world.
And so it sounds like we're going from essentially like a closed and really like a monopolistic system to, at least a proto-open market.
Well, the people who supported free trade, supported the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, would say that was the moment in which free trade was created. That they were arguing for free trade in grain, and that was a definition of freedom to them that was very fundamental to their identity and their political ideology. I wouldn't say necessarily monopolistic before that, but local. Everyone was a localvore. You hear people talk today about how they want to eat locally. Well, up until the 19th century, everyone did, because that's the way the world was. Only high-value items were shipped over long distances. So that'd be like sugar, coffee or tea, spices, these sorts of things. Bread, wheat in particular, is the first really big staple article of diet that is shipped over very long distance in very large quantities. To really understand the changes in that 1846 to 1914 period, though, as you suggest, we really need to go back and look at the system that was in place before. So if we're going to say that there's free trade in 1846, we need to understand what the restrictions were on trade before that.
Yeah, and I was just about to ask you, what kind of, if we're looking at a local market with local people using local products made in a local way, I mean, what is the kind of, platonic ideal of bread at that time, if we can say there was one?
Well, this gets to an idea that a number of different historians have approached in different ways. And so Edward Thompson calls it the moral economy. And he has a wonderful piece from 1971 that's a classic of English social history called The Moral Economy and the Crowd in 18th century Britain. Michel Foucault has addressed this as well. He refers to the same thing as an anti-scarcity system. And there's another historian named John Bostead who's done some great work on bread riots in the 18th century and before. And he calls this whole sort of apparatus, the politics of provisions. Basically, what we have is a situation in which the moral ideal, the Platonic ideal, as you said, is that people will produce for themselves, that the distance between the production and consumption of food should be as little as possible. This goes back arguably to medieval times, sort of earlier medieval times when economies were extraordinarily local. Now, we know there's a lot of commerce in late medieval and early modern England, but that idea, this concept that the producer and the consumer should be the same person obtains. So even though the grain trade within Britain will commercialize beginning in the 1600s and with greater intensity in the 1700s, there's still this idea that anyone who stands between the producer of grain and the consumer of bread is morally suspect. And this can be, a morally suspect middleman like a merchant. It can even erupt in crisis moments to people being tarred and feathered, to people having their goods seized, to people being hung.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't typically think of, because we're talking about, even though it's, it's a local kind of autochthonous, kind of an autarky of household, I guess you could say, we still have a production and a supply system. We have internal markets of wheat that goes to the miller, who then goes to the baker, and then the baker sells to the person. And there's, I guess there's middlemen in between each of those steps, if it could be. But I may be looking at this kind of like through rose-tinted glasses to the past, but generally when we think of bakers or millers, we don't think of like, shady individuals.
Right. Well, early modern English people really did not like millers at all because they saw millers as a kind of necessary service that they had to pay for. And in their mind, the millers would always take too much. So there's this kind of famous rhyme that comes from Somerset in southwest England that I don't think I have it in front of me. It goes through, it sort of, calls out the miller, and it ends by saying, "How many sacks of corn hast thou stole?" And it's interesting to hear that these English people refer to corn, that is grain, and not bread. So these are people who think of food in terms of the agricultural product, first of all. So they think of food in terms of what is grown rather than what is eaten. And in their mind, the millers were people who often had monopolies, people who would take a customary toll or who would charge too much. But the agricultural population of England really had no choice. Grinding.
Because I was going to ask you, how much, how exclusive would it be to be a miller at the time? Is this something that could not be done on a household level, or, could not be kind of, I guess you'd say, economically done?
No, it really can't be done on a household level very much at all. So there are sort of handheld milling systems, but they are laborious, and in many places they're illegal. I don't know for sure if they're fully illegal in early modern England or not. But I do know that there is virtually no mention of them at all. So if people are grinding their grain, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it's possible.
My own particular field of interest in Mesoamerica, where the equivalent of milling of maize, because when we're talking about corn here, we're talking about like just kind of a general term for grain.
Right.
But in Mesoamerica, of course, maize would really be ground in the home on metates, which are this kind of emblematic of the home system.
Yeah, and I see zero discussion of those things in early modern Britain. It's just not there. It's possible that some people did have them. They were certainly known, like Romans had them, and I'm sure they must have existed at various points in medieval England. But for whatever reason, they are simply not there. So milling is done by millers on millstones. And there's often a kind of feudal or sort of non-market aspect to it, so that some millers will have what's called a right of soak. And this is a case where a landowner, an aristocrat of some kind, as part of their feudal rights and privileges, would basically own a mill. And the benefit that he gets from owning a mill is that all of the locals are obligated to have their grain ground at that particular mill.
So it's a local monopoly in a way.
Yes. Now, it's also a controlled monopoly. So the miller is not allowed to extort people, nor is the baker, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But there are strict regulations in place that say that a miller may charge a certain customary toll. This could be a charge in money that's a set rate. It could be a portion of the grain ground. It could be the offals, the husks and bran and all that stuff. But they're not allowed to simply charge whatever they like. So there are strict controls on how much they can. So
I'm sure they never, ever cheated anyone.
No, of course not. The agricultural population hated them. Now, when we talk about baking, I think those rules are a little easier to see in baking. So in baking, it's important to remember that up until the 18th century, bakers are basically only in cities. We don't see commercial bakers in the countryside pretty much at all. And in fact, I was just looking at some documents just yesterday that were dealing with working class people, agricultural laborers in the 1860s, and I was surprised to find that something like half of them, and in fact in some areas well over half, still baked their own bread. This was a little surprising to me. But in cities, you do have to have bakers. People often don't have ovens in their home, or they don't have ovens that are good enough, or they don't have access to grain, and so they'd have to buy the grain in any case, and so it makes more sense for them to go to the baker. So what we see is that
baking at this time is kind of a labor-intensive process.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Bakers have very long hours. They work very hard. And one thing about baking is that it's really easy to mess up. And if you are a working class person and your income is limited, then it actually makes a good deal of sense to go to the baker, because the baker in that sense bears the risk. If the baker messes up a batch of bread, which happens all the time, then that's his problem. Whereas if you mess up your bread at a time when that is the fundamental food, then you could realistically screw up your food for the whole week. So there's a real logic to going to commercial bakers. But see, in cities, you have this moral economy in place. You have this set of customs, of traditions, of practices, in many cases of laws, that regulate the production and consumption of food. And they prioritize this ideal of a short distance between production and consumption. So even where someone has to be there, where an intermediary is necessary, as in the case of the baker, the baking trade itself is highly regulated. And this comes out of medieval Europe, out of medieval England. We see, I think, the earliest regulations for bakers go back to the 1200s, if not earlier. Certainly, the Company of Bakers in London had them in place by the 1300s, and these will extend all the way into the late 18th century, and they're repealed in London in 1815, and then throughout the kingdom in 1836. And what these are, this is the assize of bread. So this is a rule that takes the price of wheat and imagines that you take this a certain amount of wheat, usually in sacks of 280 pounds, and that you would bake it into a certain number of loaves of bread. It allows a certain amount of profit for the baker, a certain amount of sort of overhead for the baker, so it covers the cost of fuel and the bakery itself and candles and various things like that. And then it calculates what the just price of a loaf of bread should be. And typically bakers are expected to bake about 80 4-pound loaves out of a sack of wheat, calculates the price, and bakers are not permitted to charge more than that price. Any baker that charges over the assize price can have his shop smashed, he can get kicked out of the town, he can lose the ability to do business in that town. So the price of bread is set according to the price of wheat.
It sounds like it's kind of a trust system as well.
Yeah, well, there is a certain amount of regulation. It does fall to the guild. Usually the medieval sort of cities and early modern cities would have some kind of baker's guild. It does fall to the guild to police their members. And although I don't dig into that material quite that much, the handwriting of the 17th century is a little too much for me. It's rough. What seems to be the case is that as long as there aren't any complaints, then the city governments will just kind of let it go and let the guilds manage themselves. And the guilds look at this as their duty to society, and they do okay. They are allowed a certain level of profit. It's a stable position. So being a baker in a medieval city is hard work, but perhaps not the worst job you could have.
When we talk about bread at this time, these 4-pound loaves, these kind of, the standard size, I guess you could say, what does bread look like at this time?
Well, bread at this time would be quite dark by our standards. The loaves would not rise very much, so it would be a fairly dense kind of loaf of bread. See, the assize of bread relies on certain milling techniques, and in a way it functions as a kind of sumptuary law. See, all mills at this time are stones. Rollers don't exist yet. So if we're looking at milling in the 17th and 18th century, we're talking about 2 circular millstones that have a set of grooves carved on them to help the grain travel from a sort of inner hole where you dump it in out to the edge where the meal is collected. And in doing this, in grinding grain this way, you will reduce grain to meal, and then you will sift it in a process that's called bolting. And the nature of the grain and the nature of the mills at this time mean that you can get about 25% of any amount of wheat will come out as a sort of fine flour, a white flour. About 50% will be some level of quality below that, usually called seconds, sometimes household. And then you'll have about 25% that's offal, and the offal is typically fed to animals. There are some people who eat wholemeal bread, but the bulk of the population is eating a kind of relatively brown loaf of bread.
And so, is this a combination of that fine and that household, or is this more kind of...
Oh, sorry. No, it would almost always be either fine sort of white loaves, usually designated wheaten loaves, and then sort of darker household loaves. And the assize would come with prices for both.
Okay, so we have kind of already kind of a dual level of bread pricing there.
Right. Now, there's some consumption aspects to this because people want white bread. And why this is and how universal this is kind of a big question. Maybe we can tackle that later. But it does seem to be the case that certainly in England, certainly in the cities, in the 1600s, we are seeing basically everyone who can afford to buy white bread will buy white bread. Because they want to consume white bread, what we'll see is that millers and grain merchants will begin to take advantage of that. They will begin to buy grain from outside cities, from further distances away, and send the whitest flour into the cities where it's baked into bread and people buy it. So in the 1700s, we see lots of writers, people like Arthur Young, who did this huge survey of England and agriculture. He would sort of look at laborers, and what he'd find is that in the cities, they insisted on white bread, and they had the wages to pay for it. In the countryside, they would eat brown bread, and in many places, even not fully wheat bread. They would eat barley or rye mixed with wheat.
And so I would assume that the end of the corn laws then, because I mean, it sounds like the significance of their end was the fact that you could now start importing wheat. So, I mean, does that kind of disrupt this internal market of country brown and city white?
I would say that not quite, because I think that internal market actually gets going before free trade really kicks in. So if we look at British bakers in the early 19th century, so say from 1815 to 1846, what you find is that bakers are already importing flour or importing wheat, almost never flour at that point, but importing wheat if they can, in periods of shortage in England. So medieval England, a lot of the time in early modern England, England's agriculture was productive enough that they would actually export. And one of the big shifts that happens in the 17th century is that England's population gets large enough that they stop exporting and become generally an importer. And I think there's a few moments in the 1750s when there are wars and bad harvests in England where it becomes obvious to the people of England, to the merchant communities, to the government, to the state, that England is going to start importing grain. Probably pretty regularly.
I believe there was a guy named, what was his name? Malthus, who had something to say about that.
He did, yeah, he did. Malthus is such an interesting character, and we can come on to him later if you want.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask, when they were importing from, the continent, which is the same way they were importing this from at this time, I guess maybe there's a possibility that as we get later into this period and closer towards the 19th century, we'd see also grain from, Canada and the Americas as well. But I'm assuming most of this is from the continent?
Yeah, before 1846, and even as late as into the 1850s, I'd say, and to some extent in the 1860s, the principal sources are Eastern Europe. So there's a long tradition of trade with England and the Baltic. And so we see some of the merchants involved in that, especially the ones who congregate at a place called the Baltic Exchange, they will begin to get into grain trading. And so they'll buy from ports like Danzig and bring grain to London, where you start to see the development of a grain market there. And millers and bakers in London and the other big cities can afford, and they have access to some of these foreign supplies of grain. And the supply sort of goes up and down. And there are mixed reviews of this. So there are some bakers. It certainly seems to be the case that fine flour from Danzig can fetch a very high price, or fine wheat, I'm sorry. There are also plenty of bakers who say, don't buy this stuff. You don't know how it was handled. You don't know, what kind of farming methods were used for it. You don't know how it was shipped here. They look at this as a big risk. And it's really interesting to see how a baker in, say, the 1820s, there's one really good written account of baking in the 1820s by a guy named John White. And it's so fascinating to read because he's clearly plugged into a local economy. So when he talks about different kinds of wheat and how they make different sorts of flour, he's very interested in the agricultural techniques that go into them. So he'll say things like, you want to buy wheat that's grown on, heavy clay, but only if that farmer is also growing potatoes near it. You want to have farmers who use this kind of fertilizer, but not that kind of fertilizer. And this really speaks to a world up through the early 19th century in which bakers and millers really had a pretty good idea of where their food was coming from, or where their supplies were coming from. There's clearly evidence that
at least the point where they had this kind of local knowledge, or at least it sounds like a very in-depth but kind of also customary knowledge, where they have this very in-depth knowledge, but it's because they don't really have, it's not the broadest knowledge because they're really focused really in on one subject in one area. Literally one area, one geographic area.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a world in which commerce in England is growing rapidly. This is the period of the early Industrial Revolution. We are seeing a lot of things that really look a lot like capitalism. Whether you want to call it capitalism at this point or not is a matter of debate, but it certainly looks like it. That kind of increase in commerce, though, we have to remember, is in a world in which most transactions are still face-to-face. So what you'll find are that millers will know very well a certain set of farmers, and they will buy from those farmers consistently because they know what kind of grain those farmers produce. And if you know what kind of grain a farmer produces, you know the quality of it, the particular characteristics of it, then it's easier to work with. And bakers will do the same thing with millers. So bakers will have certain millers that they always go to. And these are based on long customary relationships. They're based on trust. You'll see accounts of people describing grain markets in sort of market towns in the rest of England, and they'll talk about how people who are known, that is, the people who are there regularly, the people who are always doing business there, don't need to carry samples of what they're selling with them because everyone knows each other and they understand that, okay, I know who I'm dealing with here. I know what kind of goods he has. If this person tries to cheat me, well, then I'm not going to do business with him anymore, and we've done business for a long time, and so that would be a huge problem for him. So there is a lot of trust built into this, a lot of local knowledge.
So, I mean, aside from the, Malthusian pressures to go seeking food imports, I mean, what was the impetus to go out of this system and go import, grain from, shady Baltic merchants? You'd said that they were importing fine grain or fine flour. So, I mean, was this just a way to supplement the more limited supplies of that, white flour that would make the wheaten bread?
Yeah, it's really about prices. It's about, when the price of grain is high in England, they can get it for cheaper in the Baltic, and then later via the Black Sea. And although we wouldn't really call it a free market, there are import duties for this. There are still moments at which it makes sense to import grain. So the way that the duties work at this point is there's kind of a sliding scale. So that if the price of wheat in England is low, then the duties will be very high. So that they can't, bring more in. There wouldn't be much motivation to do that anyway, but it's not permitted. And at the other end, if the price of grain gets real high, it has to pass a certain point before those duties start to come down. So there'll be these sort of thresholds where you might have a bad harvest in England, so the price will start to go up. It'll reach a certain point at which those import taxes start to back off, and then it makes sense for merchants to go out to Danzig and later to the Black Sea and begin to import more grain to sort of bring the price in England back down. Okay,
so I mean, yeah, so this is kind of you had mentioned it looks like capitalism because this sounds like kind of market pressures, but also still market pressures within a kind of a price controlled system.
Yes, within a moral economy, right? Because there's this view that the appropriate relationship is that producers and consumers should be close to each other. Foucault called this an anti-scarcity system because the goal of many of these regulations that were in place up until the early 19th century was to keep prices low, basically. So let me give a couple of examples. So these come from Thompson's 1971 article on the moral economy. So there are a ton of regulations on who is allowed to buy and sell grain and under what circumstances. So, for example, if you were a farmer and you had your crop, you could go into the local town and sell your grain, but you had to make your grain available for sale to the townspeople in small batches at what were considered reasonable prices. And if you tried to charge too much, then you could face their ire. If you tried to hold your grain back and not sell, which is, that's sort of capitalism 101, right? Is if the price is too low, then don't sell. Wait for the price to go up. They're not permitted to do that. They must make their grain available to the townspeople at certain prices, or it will be seized, or the townspeople would be morally justified, and in many cases legally not prosecuted at all for going out and simply seizing grain. And what they'll typically do is they'll go out and they'll take it, and then they will pay the price that they think should have been charged. It's a moral economy, So the idea is that there's a sort of right of subsistence, that everyone has a right to a certain amount of subsistence at a certain price. Now, shortages certainly occur. Like, there are famines. Famines are a thing. You can have terrible harvests, and people can go very hungry. The benefit of these systems is that if that happens, then everyone will go hungry together, which goes a long way toward maintaining social cohesion.
Yeah, and I was going to say the fact that if you are in this system where, and I'm glad you mentioned famines, because that's what I was thinking of, like if you're in a system, your world exists where famines occur and are known, then someone literally holding back food that they have to sell becomes it is a moral crisis rather than just an economic one.
Yes, and it will lead to violence. People will be killed for that. And they are. So this is a thing that definitely happens.
To go back to these Baltic merchants, I guess, were they subject to these same kind of moral imperatives, I guess you could say?
Well, sort of. The duties on grain basically are that. They don't permit these merchants to import grain and manipulate prices. So they sort of protect the prices for landowners, really. Landowners are the ones that put these regulations in place to keep the level of grain at the price of grain at a certain point. So it's a regulated market.
Yeah, were there luxury grains that people would go out seeking, or this area in the lower Rhine Valley produces the finest flour you might ever find anywhere?
The closest you get to that is that in the middle of the 19th century, so as this is winding down and as we get to the repeal of the Corn Laws, fine flour from Austria, not grain, but actual flour from Austria, will become a real luxury product. And this is because the Austrians are the first ones that figure out roller milling. And roller mills sort of change the calculus with the amount of flour you can get from wheat and the quality, the whiteness of that flour. And they are able to produce a pretty significant amount of much whiter flour than what you'd otherwise find. And they'll begin to export this to Britain, among other places, and this becomes quite a luxury product.
Now, are they using the same, style or varietal or variety or strain? I'm not sure the correct terminology, but are they using the same wheat that you would find in Britain? They're just processing it differently, or are they using like a different type of wheat?
Well, they would be different types of wheat, but just as important is the climate. Climate and the soil, as well as the variety of wheat, all combine to produce wheat that is highly variable depending on where it's grown, what kind it is, what the weather was like that year.
Whether there are potatoes grown nearby.
Exactly, yeah. John Waite would certainly say so, yes. And the thing with English wheat is that it is soft. Both the grains themselves are soft, and the flour is soft. So we'll often talk about flour as being hard or soft, and this is a measure of how much gluten there is. So hard flour has real high gluten. Soft flour has lower gluten. Now,
before we move on to that, just a quick biochemical aside, what is gluten and why is it significant?
It's a protein, and it's the protein in wheat. There's more of it in wheat than any other grain. And when you make bread, you mix water with the flour, and by kneading, you create a sort of protein matrix. Like this sort of dough is really just very stretchy proteins that when you charge with gas, either through yeast and leavening or through baking soda, through some kind of chemical leavening, you create gas, which is then captured in this protein matrix of gluten. So if you have a dough with real high gluten, it can capture a lot more gas, and that will make the bread rise. It'll make it more porous. It'll make it more chewy. It'll be sort of lighter and for many people more pleasant to eat. If you bake a loaf of bread with say barley, especially something like whole wheat barley, where there's not that much gluten and there's a lot of other stuff mixed in, a lot of bran and germ mixed in, it's not going to create such a strong matrix of protein, and it's not going to capture as much gas. So it's going to be a loaf that's much darker in color, that's much denser and sort of heavier. Well, not necessarily heavier, but denser in sort of texture.
I would assume, though, in the early 19th century, they weren't really talking about protein matrices and lattice works for capturing CO2 gas production.
No, they don't use those terms.
So, I mean, when they were talking about hard and soft, I mean, what were they kind of, was this kind of like subjective standards, or did they have, because you mentioned soil made a big difference. So, I mean, do they have certain ideas about this is soft in that kind of subjective standard way, and this area grows hard in this kind of, again, the same kind of subjective way?
Yeah, they're really based on what the bakers say, on how the bakers handle the flour, how they make it into bread, and then what customers think of it. So there are some advantages for bakers to have flour that's harder. And if a flour is harder and has more gluten, it can often absorb more water. Now, the way that bread is priced is in the early modern period, there's often not enough coinage to have very fine differences of price. So it'd be difficult, say, for a baker to, according to the assize, to, if the price of wheat rises or falls, to shift the price of a 4-pound loaf by, half a farthing or something like that. So what they tend to do instead is slightly alter the weight of the bread. But the weight of the bread is vital. So what they'll do in the early 19th century, when there is enough coinage to have finer gradations, is they will set the loaf of bread at 4 pounds. And they'll say, this is a quartern loaf, a quarter of a peck. A quartern loaf of bread, standard article of commerce. And they'll say that all bread must be bought and sold in 4-pound units. So for the baker then, what matters is being able to buy a sack of wheat and transform that sack of wheat into as many 4-pound loaves as possible. I mentioned earlier that a rule of thumb in the early modern period was about 80, and that's common for English flour, which is fairly soft. You'll get good bakers or bakers who are using the highest quality, and they'll get, say, 82, 83. They might average 84 if they're quite good. But what they'd really like to do is get flour that would let them bake, say, 90 or 95, because that's just profit for them. They're just getting more, they're turning that raw material into more bread. And the way that you do that is by adding more water.
So, I mean, they're literally, I guess you could say, stretching their flour supply.
Yes. And stronger flours with higher gluten will bake into taller, sort of lighter and more porous loaves. They'll bake into more of them because the dough will absorb more flour overall. So it's what the customer wants almost always, and it makes more profit for the baker. So they want to bake the whitest stuff they can. They want strong flour if they can get it.
Yeah, so, this reputation for this Austrian wheat that was using rollers, but at the same time, Britain, as I take it, is still using millstones. So do we see this shift in Britain from stones, however they work in relation to making these hard, soft wheats, over to rollers and that can handle, I guess, harder wheat?
Yeah, so with English wheat, it is white in color, it's soft, and it's fairly low gluten. But the fact that the grains themselves are fairly soft and often fairly damp mean that it works really well on millstones. So they'll run the grain through the millstones in a process that's called low grinding or called sudden death, where you have your two millstones turning and you'll have this hole in the middle. You pour the grain straight into the middle. You just grind it all at once. You reduce it right into a meal, and then you simply sift the meal and you pull off the various grades of flour and offal that you want. English wheat works great for that because the grains themselves being soft, when they're actually crushed between the two millstones, the bran and the germ, and if any husks make it in, they'll simply flatten out. They'll come out in these nice broad flakes. And those are nice and easy to sort of sift out, right? They're big chunks. They're not a problem.
I take it this was not the case if you're using a literal harder wheat.
No, it's not. It's not. And so they repeal the Corn Laws in 1846 and they open Britain up to free trade in grain. And in doing that, it takes a little while for the supplies of foreign wheat to really start rolling in. But one of the first places that begins to send grain to Britain is actually California. So in the 1850s, you have the post-gold rush population of California is several 100,000 people, most of whom did not make any money gold mining. And they settle in California's Central Valley, and it's actually not bad wheat land. So they begin to farm wheat, and they ship it out from San Francisco to Liverpool through the 1850s. and British millers begin to get their hands on this California wheat. And they find that, the color is not too bad. It's stronger because California is a warmer and drier climate, so the character of the wheat is slightly different. But the problem is that it's hard and it's very dry. And so if you try to grind that kind of wheat on millstones, you risk fires. Mills catch on fire all the time anyway. And running, dry, hard wheat through these millstones can lead to so much friction that they will burst into flame.
Well,
right. Yeah, it's pretty insane.
That is not what I was expecting.
Right?
The other problem that you come up with is that if the bran is hard and dry especially, then you grind it in this low grinding system. What will happen to the bran is it'll shatter. And these little bits of bran will then get mixed up in the meal, and you can't sift them out. So it will discolor the flour. And so what you'll have then is flour that bakes okay, and you can get a good price for it and all that, but it'll be slightly off color. And so it won't get the price you could otherwise get for white flour.
So you have, no, trust me, it tastes fine, but
yeah,
literally nobody's buying it.
Yeah, people don't want it. And we'll talk about bakers and adulteration if we get to that point, because bakers have ways around that. But really it's a problem for the millers, because the bakers don't want to buy this flour because it's darker in color. They want nice white flour. And that problem exists with California wheat. They will increasingly find, as other sources of wheat around the world sort of come online, Britain will begin to import large amounts from the Midwestern United States, especially the upper Midwest, like the Dakotas, from Canada as well. These are climates, the Dakotas, Manitoba, these are cold places, and the wheat that they'll grow there, they're fairly dry places as well. They can grow wheat there that's extraordinarily strong. They can bake into very high, very porous, very highly risen loaves of bread that people will love. Strong, high gluten flour.
Yes.
But is the wheat also hard in the sense that we've been talking about, the actual kernel itself?
Exactly. So it's very difficult to grind on millstones. The same is true with flour from Russia. They'll find as well with flour from India. And really, after the Corn Laws are repealed, you'll see all these sources of wheat sort of spring up around the world. California is the first one, and California will be a major supplier from the United States to Britain until about 1900, and then California farmers turn to specialty crops like citrus. Farmers in the American Midwest will come online after the Civil War, and especially in the 1870s. So by the 1870s, we're seeing a really big stream of wheat that is passing from the Dakotas through Minneapolis, which becomes a major milling center at the time, also through Chicago, which is a major point for the purchase and sale of grain futures. There's a big grain market there. It'll then pass through either the St. Lawrence Seaway and on to England, or to the eastern U.S. cities, New York, say, and then on to England as well. About the same time, England begins to import large quantities from Russia, from India, and later in the 19th century, the early 20th century, Canada, Australia, and Argentina become major suppliers as well. Basically, any part of the world that grew significant amounts of wheat at this time was going to export to Britain.
I kind of have two questions here, actually, before we get too far into the depths here. I really have two questions, and they're somewhat related, I guess you could say. The first would even just kind of go back and be and ask, well, what do rollers do that can handle this harder wheat? Okay. And I think the related question here is, even if rollers didn't start getting used in Britain, I mean, couldn't they just have that flour be milled in, say, Minneapolis, using techniques that would make it, an acceptable flour for British bakers, as opposed to milling it in Britain?
So the answer to the second question is they do. And then let me answer the first question. So what rollers do is allow you to mill the wheat in a totally different way. So instead of doing that low grinding or sudden death version of milling that millstones use, they allow you to do a process called high grinding, or gradual reduction. And what you do there is you take these rollers, these are steel rollers, and they're much more precise than millstones. You can You can adjust the speed at which they rotate. They can use either fluted, where they have little grooves on them, or smooth ones. And because you can adjust the distance between them very precisely, you can run grain through and do just enough to sort of crack it, just enough to knock it down a little bit. And that allows millers to sort of loosen the bran, and they can run it through once, and each time they run it through, they can then sift it. So they'll run it through once with a real high grind. They will loosen the brand, then they'll sift the brand off, and then they're left with what are called middlings, which are these particles of just the starch that are pretty big. And then they can run those through slowly, through rollers again, slowly reducing them to the consistency of flour they want. And this allows you to get much whiter flour out of a given amount of wheat. So I mentioned earlier that English millers would use millstones, and they'd get about 25% would be sort of a fine flour, about 50% would be some kind of brown flour, about 25% offal. What they can do with rollers is a short patent would be, say, 30 to 40% of the grain as super white flour, much whiter than the white you'd get from millstones, and therefore more expensive. Or they could do like a long patent and get, say, 60% of the weight of the wheat as pretty fine white flour. So suddenly with these rollers, they can get a lot more white flour than they got before.
And that's using the same wheat they were using before.
Yeah, that's and it's even better if they're going to use hard wheat from America or from Russia or India. The first people to develop roller mills are Austrians, because the Austro-Hungarian sort of plain has pretty good wheatlands. They are warmer and a little drier, so they can grow a pretty hard wheat. Now, the Austrians are the first to figure out that you can use rollers in this way, but they don't automate the process. They have a very labor-intensive way of doing it, where they will run it through and then they'll sift it by hand, say. The Americans in the 1860s, especially in Minneapolis, will take those Austrian techniques and they will automate the process. They will set up not just roller mills, but a whole system designed to grind the grain, to sift it, to purify it, to remove particles of various sizes. They'll also come up with a related set of machinery to clean it, because grain can be quite dirty, right? You'll get it, and it is an agricultural product, so it can have dirt mixed into it. So they come up with devices that'll clean it, and they automate this. So this allows them to get really white flour with much less labor involved. So the American mills in Minneapolis in the 1860s, some of which are still there, in fact, will begin to send this really fine flour to Britain. And British millers initially are not that worried about it. And initially they think, the Atlantic is a big ocean. Any American miller sending us already processed flour has to overcome the price of freight. And California Liverpool is, I believe, 14,000 miles. It's a 9-month trip. So it's not cheap, even under the best of circumstances. But this is the period of the Industrial Revolution. We are watching railway networks expand across the North American continent. Remember that the Transcontinental Railroad is 1869. We'll see steamships play an increasing role in the transatlantic commerce. And the price of freight is going to drop dramatically, so that those millers in Minneapolis can begin to compete with millers in Britain.
I just wanted to ask, because you'd mentioned how labor intensive this could be and how the Americans were automating this. I just wanted to kind of briefly ask, what were the sources of power? Because we're talking very industrial things here. We're talking railroads and steamships and intercontinental travel. We're not still seeing the use of like windmills, are we? Or are we seeing like steam mills?
There are both. So the mills in Minneapolis are there because there's a fall in the Mississippi. So that industry, that sort of center of milling industry, does get its start with water. And water and wind are definitely power sources that are used in Britain at this time still. But even in the late 1700s, there were already steam-powered mills. Steam engines are a thing. So it's really a matter of where you are. If you are in a city, especially in England, and you're trying to mill grain in the city, then it makes a lot of sense to use steam power, to just buy coal to just run a steam engine, and there's plenty of examples of that. There's also at this time, though, plenty of millers who are still what are called country millers. And these are millers who are outside of town. They are out in the countryside someplace where they might not have access to fuel. They might have good sites for water or wind, and so they will use whatever is locally available. But Britain will begin to import more and more grain after 1846, really after 1870. So 1870 is kind of a big moment. It's sort of a pivot. We see a lot of grain from America begin to really pour into British cities, a lot of grain from Russia. British farmers begin to really talk about how they are having trouble keeping up with the fall in prices because they're now competing with farmers in America and Russia and elsewhere after about the mid-1870s. At that point, we see British millers begin to try to respond to the growth of the American milling industry. That is, they're going to try to adopt roller mills and mill whiter flour, and they will also migrate to the cities. So we'll see a dramatic reduction in the number of mills that actually exist in Britain in the last quarter of the 19th century. I forget the numbers exactly, so I may be off, but I believe there's something like 10,000 mills of all kinds throughout Britain in, say, I don't know, maybe 1865. By World War I, you're looking at like 2,000, because the country mills are going to shut down pretty much. Milling will become an urban thing. It'll become a thing that's done in port cities, where they are milling largely imported grain.
Yeah, so I mean, at the same time we're seeing this, explosion of mills, we're also seeing, it sounds like a radical shift in the way that milling is actually carried out. So
Absolutely.
How is this knowledge being disseminated? Because it sounds like we've gone from essentially like a feudal system, people thinking it would be not out of place in like a, medieval England with, this moral law that, and, the rights of souk to take certain things and this kind of set monopolistic, prices and distributions and, local farmers giving to local millers, giving to local bakers to, and I know it's trite to say this, but a global market. So, I mean, how were all these new ideas, and not only just about the market, but also about these like technologies of steam driven rollers being disseminated to all this new class of millers?
Well, the millers do what any good industry will do, and they create a trade press. In fact, the journal The Miller was founded in 1875. That's the London-based one. There's one in Liverpool founded, I believe, just after, called Milling. And these are journals that exist explicitly to deal with this problem, because you have these millers who, starting with the California wheat in the 1850s, intensifying all the time as imports roll in from new places, they find that every time they get wheat from a new place, it's different. It varies from year to year. It varies based on the climate of the origin. It varies based on the techniques of the farmers. They have to figure out how to work with all of these. And so millers and the milling sort of technical or trade press that develops from the 1870s on is explicitly engaged in learning the sort of environmental origins of the various kinds of wheat that they produce. Because what they need to do is find ways to take all this wheat from around the world and produce a flour that is more or less homogeneous. Bakers will not accept flour that is very strong one month but very weak the next month. They will not buy from that miller. They don't want flour that's going to change color all the time, or batches that are inconsistent. Bakers want stuff to be the same all the time. So what millers will do... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
We're talking about this as though there's like, there's one single unified, British market, like there's one guy who buys all the bread in Britain for everyone, and what he wants matters. But I mean, particularly with the fact that there's all these new varieties and, new variations on wheat coming in. I mean, do we see... local variants as they try to, tweak the amount of, Russian winter wheat that they're using in conjunction with California summer wheat, combined with, regular old humdrum British wheat to make something? I mean, do we have like a Liverpool style or like a London style or like a Glasgow style?
What we see, so there are regional differences in the kinds of bread that are preferred. But that's less to do with the millers and more to do with the bakers. So the biggest difference, so the two really big differences are that cities, especially cities in England, want white bread. They want the whitest bread you can get, and they want the loaves to be as tall and sort of handsome as possible. Scottish consumers, on the other hand, country consumers will have brown bread. They are much more amenable to brown bread. As I mentioned sort of toward the beginning, home baking does persist in some areas. It turns out that home baking persists where fuel prices are lowest. Some places like Newcastle, where there are lots of coal, then they continue to bake at home for a long time. But basically, you've got white bread in the cities, brown bread in the countryside. The other division is that English bread needs to be sweet. There has to be a kind of sweet flavor to it. Scottish bread, on the other hand, is sour. Scottish consumers want sour bread. Now, the flour that's used for these things doesn't have to be that different. I've never seen discussions of, say, Glasgow millers saying that they need certain kinds, even though the bread that you'd get in Glasgow would be quite different from the bread that you'd get, say, in London.
So basically we're saying that there may not be kind of, there may be kind of general large regional differences, but, overall the greater market is towards this white, sweet bread.
Yeah, I'd say so. One historian has argued that by 1900 you can describe what he calls a national loaf. That is a kind of generic, relatively sweet, relatively white, highly risen loaf of wheaten bread.
Even as kind of nationalism hits in kind of the political sense, we also see, a national loaf. And unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to leave it off for now. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the stunning conclusion of baking and milling in the 19th century Britain. Until then, I hope you saw how that one single, very modest consumer product, bread, which is also, a staple of life, can have connections to so many things, and that you can kind of look at an entire society through a piece of bread. I mean, I guess if you cut like a hole in it, but also metaphorically, in the sense that something that is so intrinsic and so basic to that society, such as its staple food, by looking at the changes at that, you can kind of also use it as a diagnostic for how the rest of the society is changing. And in this case, we're seeing this shift to, modernity, this shift to people getting their products not just from this kind of closed local feudal system into what we would see today as like an open, if not necessarily kind of the global market we see now, but at least a beginning of that, something where you might, be getting a very standardized industrial bread product that is baked in Britain, but is sourcing, wheat from or even, ground flour from the Midwest of the United States. And later on in the next episode, we'll see how we start getting shipments in from India or from Australia, and how we see that this idea of, bread is not only getting wrapped up in this idea of a changing society, but also in Britain's kind of increasingly imperial role in the world, where it does have access to this global market to feed its home country. So I hope you'll come back for the next episode and enjoy that with me. In the meantime, once again, thanks to all our Patreon subscribers. You've been more than generous, and I hope to find more ways I can kind of refer you back with that, with the the kind of the warmth of your hearts and wallets you have shown us. Until then, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. We are also now on Google Play, which is having podcasts. I can't give you the URL because Google Play, like iTunes, uses an increasingly funky string of nonsensical characters to do that. But if you go to the discussion post on Ask Historians, you can go ahead and click on the link that we have provided there. So feel free to rate and review us on Google Play as well. We're also available on SoundCloud. That's kind of our second home. So if you like us there, you can see us there. We have a YouTube page, which sadly my co-host, who has had to go off and do things like finish his degree, is no longer kind of updating. So I'm going to be taking that over and hopefully getting the newer episodes out on YouTube. So if you're subscribed to us on YouTube, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. I'm coming back. Just don't eat each other on the island of YouTube before I can return with a rescue ship. So until then, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians. and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.